Okay, it is now 2:05, which means it's time for us to get started with our international armchair session. Just as I add the panelists to the panel list, I would like to introduce Michelle Gauthier, who's a special advisor to the CRDCN, and she will be hosting today's armchair session.
Thank you, Grant. Bon matin, bon après-midi ou bonsoir à nos collègues de partout au pays ainsi qu'outre-mer. Comme Grant l'a bien dit, je m'appelle Michelle Gauthier et j'ai le plaisir et le privilège d'être conseillère spéciale du réseau. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette session intitulée « Démocratisation des données, équilibrer les données privées et l'engagement public ». I'm moderating today's armchairs or virtual armchairs discussion from Ottawa, which is built on the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The people of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their past and present contributions. Nous sommes ravis de souhaiter la bienvenue à l'une des nôtres, Tracy Afifi, chercheuse au sein du réseau. Tracy est professeure au Collège de médecine Max Ready en sciences de la santé communautaire et détient une chaire de recherche du Canada niveau 1 à l'Université du Manitoba. We're also very pleased to welcome some of our international colleagues. So welcome to Jean Holm, Deputy CIO and the Mayor's Senior Tech Advisor at the City of Los Angeles. Jean was also an evangelist for open data at the White House, among her many other roles and responsibilities. And we'd like to welcome as well Deborah Yates, who is the data governance lead at KPMG in London, England, and former program lead for data assurance at the Open Data Institute. And I believe we're ready to go. All three of these highly accomplished colleagues have grappled with the issue of how to democratize and provide more public access to data while ensuring its confidentiality and security. And given that our time together is short, I will refer you to the conference website for their distinguished bios, and will invite each of them in turn to take 3 to 4 minutes to tell you a little bit more about themselves and how they approach this issue from their respective experiences and vantage points, both from the countries in which they operate, but also as a researcher, a data provider, and a policy expert. We'll begin with Tracy and then turn to Deborah and follow with Jean. J'invite aussi nos participants à noter leurs questions pour les conférencières. Vous pouvez faire ainsi dans la boîte de questions-réponses et il nous fera plaisir d'aborder ces questions-là suite aux remarques d'introduction de nos conférencières et quelques petites questions que j'aurai à leur poser. Alors, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm sure you'll have lots of them for our speakers, and we'll get to them in due course. Tracy, à vous la parole. Over to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me today to talk about this really important topic. I am a researcher, and I've been accessing data from different parts of the world for the last 23 years. These data sets have been mostly large population-based surveys in the area of health, which do contain sensitive information. Interestingly, the process of data collection was very different depending on where the data were from, and over time, the process of gaining data has definitely evolved. In the early 2000s, I was accessing data from Canada, the United States, and the Netherlands. All data sets contain similar information. However, each country had its own process for access. For some data sets in the United States, I could just easily download from a public link, or I would provide my name and institution and reasons for why I wanted access to the data. And then a de-identified data set was sent to me with few or no restrictions. The process was similar for data in the Netherlands. In Canada, the access to data has always been much harder and more complicated, and full data sets could only be accessed from a research data center or an RDC. After a lengthy process. To complicate the issue, I lived at the time in an area that didn't have an RDC. Over the last 20 years, access to data has changed. And interestingly, in the United States, I would say that more restrictions have come into place. I could no longer download a link, but I could still access the data fairly easily and was allowed a de-identified data set to be transferred to my secure lab where I could work on approved projects. Data from Statistics Canada became easier for me to access because an RDC did open in my area, but the process was still fairly unchanged and the need to go physically to the RDC and to have the data vetted was still in place. Notably, there's still many locations in Canada where RDCs do not exist. The data I work with are sensitive and privacy is always top priority. However, I think it's important that we recognize that that data that is de-identified, meaning that it doesn't have names, birth dates, addresses, or any other identifying information, are data that do maintain privacy. With all the data sets that I've used over the last 20 years, I could never identify an individual who would be in the data set, even with sophisticated modeling. For this reason, data access should not be restricted based on privacy concerns. I agree that privacy remains a top priority, but I believe concerns of privacy are often overstated. Another consideration is that collecting data is expensive. It easily costs millions of dollars for large population-based data collections. Often the data sets are unused or underused. And I believe that, that this may be in part by challenges of accessing the data. It's a long and difficult process, which may mean that many qualified researchers are choosing not to access the data, or that they're limited in the number of projects that they're able to complete because of time commitments needed to go through the data access process. With the process being difficult and needing to be at an RDC to do the work, the restricted and also the strict data vetting rules, data access can become challenging and often inequitable. If the process of data access was easier and if full de-identified data sets could be provided to researchers in a secure research lab rather than RDC only, then we would see great improvements in productivity among Canadian researchers, resulting in better investments in these large data collections, more evidence-based findings that would benefit Canadians, and advancement to science in Canada in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I think you've laid out a vision that aligns well with the future of the CRDCN. When you speak about periods of time where you didn't have access to the data because of the lack of a physical presence, the fact that CRDCN is now moving to a hybrid model where the democratization will continue and those who are not physically close to a site will be able to have access will be an important, I think, development in terms of being able to address some of your concerns. And we will come back to the whole issue of how we make it a less onerous process for researchers. But I think that's a good segue to you, Deborah, because a lot of your work has been on the other side of the coin, so to speak, thinking about how as a data provider, you can make that access feasible for researchers who, as we know in Tracy and others' case, are very, very keen to be able to work with those data to advance their own research, but also for the benefit of the respective countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, to tell you a bit about me. So I've worked in the data world for about 11 years now. My initial steps into this world was in the public sector in the UK, where I worked for one of the big agencies that looked after a lot of the environmental information that the government collect and make available for people. And so we'd already been committed back in 2011 to be an open organisation and to try and publish as much data as we could. But from the inside perspective, it was very much a slowly, when we're ready, we'll get bits and pieces done as we've got time, as we've got resources. That all changed when we had some really severe flooding in the UK in about 2014, and there was a big political change actually in focus, where we were asked to quite quickly share some of the data that we had on flooding, and from there the floodgates metaphorically and literally opened to actually providing more access to the data that we held as an organisation. And so I was part of the team then that was trying to lead that approach to open data, to make sure that we had the good data practices in place and that we had decent publishing processes in order to get that available. And it was just interesting, Tracy, what you're saying there about the, not being able, never been able to identify an individual and things, but that was one of the very valid, genuine concerns from colleagues, accountable for the data within the organisation. We don't want to get ourselves in hot water. How do you actually get around that? So finding ways within that process to, provide assurance both internally and externally was a real challenge. Since then, I've been involved in rolling out GDPR, so I've had insights into what that's like on the sort of data management side in terms of that protection of personal data. I worked for a not-for-profit institute, as you mentioned, Michelle, the Open Data Institute for the last 4 years. I just changed a few months ago, actually. But my role there was very much advice and guidance to organisations that are trying to do the same thing. They were trying to make more of what they had available and trying to do that in ways that they were happy with, that they felt comfortable with. And it's really interesting, actually, being able to work across so many different types of organisations. From a data management perspective, everyone's struggling with the same things. And so it's a real pleasure to come here today to sort of bring that perspective. Yeah, I'll definitely be commenting from the side of view of good data practices. How do you get those foundations in place in order to make that data sustainably available? Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for those opening remarks. And it's fascinating when you refer to the flooding incidents as, in essence, having opened the floodgates. And I think it's a good reminder to us all that there are internal drivers of change within organizations that have impact in terms of the decisions, but there are also external factors. And I think the reality we've all lived through most recently with COVID and the pandemic is another indicator that at times accelerates not necessarily the willingness, but the ability of organizations and governments and data providers to make the data available so that we can answer new questions in new ways and answer old questions in new ways as well. And I think as we turn now to Jean, it'll be interesting to get your perspective in terms of what kind of policy frameworks and governance frameworks help to facilitate this expedited access to data and help to provide the kind of reassurance that Deborah has been looking to provide in terms of the advice and guidance that she's given to some of the data providers to be able to make data available with confidence.
Sure. Well, my experience in data may go back just a little further. So when I started, I was at NASA for 30 years, and we were sharing data via FTP and Gopher sites. So that's way back in the day. And it didn't deal with people individually, of course. It was satellite data. So it was climate data, Earth observation data, that kind of thing. And, it was always this question about how many people are using our data. Well, from NASA, where we started sharing it obviously in more usable and understandable ways and a little bit of context around it, I then went to work for the White House for President Obama. I was the architect behind data.gov with Vivek Kundra, who was the CIO for the government at the time. And we started with 37 data sets across the entire federal government. So it was an experiment that we weren't really sure was going to work. If we aggregate the data together and make it easier to access, is that helpful to researchers? The researchers were kind of our first audience, but also businesses behind it, because a lot of the federal agencies provide information which is really helpful to businesses. That eventually grew to 175 agencies sharing over 300,000 data sets today. And so, during that time, we learned a lot. We learned about, the fact that the mosaic effect, which I think is somewhat what I think Tracy was talking about, where things got a little harder to access. We realized that two data sets, which together don't seem to release any information when combined, actually start to be able to de-anonymize the data. And so we had to take special care to protect people's privacy, which is difficult then for researchers who are trying to use disaggregated data. So with data.gov, we learned about the privacy issues. We learned about communities of practice, trying to get researchers, businesses, and the government agencies that release that data together so that researchers could directly ask the government folks what it is that they wanted in what formats. And we started switching from just, okay, let's just be honest, like Excel downloads to machine readable and human understandable data. So we put context around it. We had a data steward for each data set that you could ask questions of, and then we had it in machine readable ways with it, and eventually with an open API. I went on to work with the World Bank in Sub-Saharan Africa and India and Russia. And again, it was really looking at how do we take countries like Uganda and Sierra Leone and Ghana that are really just starting some of these online services and finding where the data is, validating that data, which can be really difficult in some cases, and then being able to share that data in ways that are usable. And this kind of grew my concept of data sharing to also data journalists. Data journalists actually in Africa have been a huge group that has been helpful in disseminating capacity building, training, and the use of data to advocate for different initiatives and understand government services and the equity or inequity of government services in different neighborhoods. Eventually, I came back to work for my hometown. So I'm actually now the deputy mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And here, what we've done is understood that in a very local government, the policies are slightly different in that researchers we need to know how to better provide the services to very specific types of individuals. And so we have methods for researchers to apply to get access to some of that data so that they can help us make those services better and more targeted. But then they also have contracts that they sign with us that say they aren't going to share the data and they're going to keep the information anonymized, even if we give them disaggregated data. So it has, in some cases, probably made it easier for researchers to find that data exists, prompt government organizations to put out data in different ways or with different kinds of formats. But at the same time, our citizens and residents have given us feedback that says we also want it, like that's our data. We don't want to share it with everybody. And so only under explicit allowances and circumstances are we able to do that. And I think, you know, Deborah mentioned something about emergencies, and sometimes during an emergency, there are specific issues when human lives are at risk. And so there are some situations, but in general, researchers are looking for the long term. And so we found this evolution of policies is really this balance between wanting very disaggregated data and the citizens not wanting to necessarily share all of that with everybody.
Thank you, Jean. I think it's incredible when we think of you going from 37 data sets to more than 3,000 being shared, and just the evolution over the course of your career and involvement in so many different settings. And I don't know a lot about NASA, but certainly would think that that is an environment in which security and confidentiality is particularly important as well. So recognizing that as we move forward, what I'm hearing in the commentary is that there are many stakeholders involved, and it's a question of, at each step of the way, understanding the culture of each of these organizations, the expectations, the risks and responsibilities that each have to assume. And as a result of that, you know, how do we get to a shared end goal of trying to ensure that these data are used for public good in a way that does not undermine the well-being of the individuals or organizations or businesses that provided the information in the first instance. When we look to do these types of international panels, oftentimes we're motivated by a sense of being able to learn from each other, best practices, promising practices, new innovations, etc. And so maybe, Deborah, if I can come back to you, I'd be curious to know, when you look at the UK, or in light of your experiences internationally in Europe or elsewhere, what you see as a really promising practice or innovation in this space in terms of being able to move from guardianship to accessibility while taking into consideration all the issues you outlined in your opening remarks.
Yeah, sure. And we're obviously in an interesting position in the UK at the moment, having had the referendum to leave Europe. We're in the process of reforming a lot of our data and digital legislation at the moment. But I won't go down that rabbit hole. One thing that comes to mind, though, is some work actually that my former colleagues at the ODI have been quite heavily involved in. And it's around this concept of independent stewardship of data. Which I know there's pockets internationally, but certainly in the UK, it's sort of gaining traction. And the idea of it is that when there is a set of data on a particular topic, particularly when it might be sensitive, so something like health data, the idea that you appoint an independent group to govern and manage access to that data. It can be referred to in different ways: data trusts, data institutions, data collaboratives, whatever you call it. The idea being that, you know, there's this trusted independent group that aren't linked to big business, pharmaceutical companies, you know, all of the things that make people a bit nervous. And that there's that agreed set of, you know, this is how we're going to manage it. These are the parameters that you can access it under. But then also that the communities that the data might be about, or that have contributed to the data, can be engaged and have a way to help sort of shape the way that data is handled and made available to people. So that's the main thing that comes to mind, I think, in answer to that one. Is that something that anyone else has come across?
Jean or Tracy, any type of similar experience? Deborah, are there researchers who sit on that independent group?
I think it depends on the types of data. I don't know enough about the detail of the specific makeup of these sort of committees to answer that one, I'm afraid. But I can share some links to examples of them in the chat a bit later.
That would be great, Deborah. I ask in part because, you know, Tracy, in terms of bringing that perspective to the table, I understood from your comments, Deborah, that, you know, the public might view differently those who are in big business or et cetera. And so I'm wondering how we bridge that gap between the researchers and the public in terms of those efforts, and whether through an initiative like this one, we might be able to do that. Jean, from your experience, innovations in the US right now, I know you've been part of many of them, but any beyond the ones that you've shared with us that would be important to highlight?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting work going on with machine learning and artificial intelligence in both human-centered and environmental-centered ways. So, I mean, humans are in the environment, but kind of with people and the climate. So one of the ones we're doing actually with NASA at the City of Los Angeles is around air quality. So we're combining satellite data with ground sensors from our Internet of Things. And we also pass out small air quality sensors to people in neighborhoods who just want to participate. So we call them our neighborhood scientists. And they can choose to then connect that data coming from their sensor to the greater network. And then we predict with pretty high accuracy the air quality over the next 2 weeks, which helps us plan city events and also helps parents whose children might have asthma to understand, you know, how they want to prepare for this. One of the things that we've done, though, and I think we're seeing more and more of this, is that we've open sourced the methodology, we've open sourced the code, and we've open sourced the data, so that, and the data is global, we use global resources so that any city can adopt that and use it. And so in this case, we want to make sure that what one city learns builds off of another city. And then, so we're working with Durban, South Africa, with London, and with Mexico City as early adopters of this. And it's just been really helpful, especially as we start to move forward. When we think about it, from a people-centered perspective, we really want to, we're looking kind of to what Tracy was saying earlier, or Deborah, was we don't have an IRB particularly at the city, but what we do is for sensitive data, particularly around people receiving services like our homeless services, then we have an independent board that works kind of across the city and county governments to make sure that researchers who need access to that data have a reason that they're protecting that data, what are the outcomes they're expecting to do, and what security layers they're using. So I think we're seeing those different sorts of things, but the ability to predict, and even during COVID, we were trying to predict the neighborhoods that were likely to have outbreaks before they had outbreaks, which did a lot of socioeconomic data as well. And so I think it's really interesting to see that when you have this data open and accessible and reliable in an emergency or in an urgent situation, how do you combine it for either clear analytics or inferential analytics in some cases to be able to better provide services?
Thank you, Jean. What I'm hearing in terms of the relationship with the public is that through these initiatives, you're developing transparency, you're developing trust, you're developing communications means, and an ability for members of the public to be able to use the data for the well-being of their own lives, as opposed to simply being recipients or intermediaries for either the collection or use of that data. And Tracy, I know you do a lot of work in the mental health space and working with children as well, and would imagine that that would be a very sensitive area as well. So when you're trying to balance as a researcher, on the one hand, wanting to have the best quality data, and on the other hand, an understanding of how those who are providing the data or those about whom the data has been collected would feel if there was ever a breach. How do you navigate that space yourself in terms of those relationships, even if you're not the primary data collector yourself in all instances?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important to realize that when we're collecting data, it's especially, in the area I work in, as you mentioned, health and so often related to children and adverse experiences, the data are very sensitive. And we need to make sure that we have informed consent from the individuals providing the data. And also provide them the opportunity to determine how they want their own data used. So that has to be thought of in advance before we start analyzing the data, and they need to agree to those arrangements. So if they are allowing their data to be shared with other researchers or not, and if they say no, then that data remains protected and it isn't able to be shared. If it is shared, then it's the responsibility of those who are the guardians of the data to make sure that privacy and confidentiality are protected. So I still completely believe that it is the #1 priority. I do think there are ways that we can maintain that privacy and confidentiality while still providing access to individuals. So I think sometimes we think that we can identify people in data sets that have been de-identified. And if we're careful about how we de-identify data, it's actually not possible for me to know that this person in, this out of, 20,000 people, this one individual is this person. And sometimes I think we lean on that too much and then provide too many restrictions on how we can use the data or who can access the data because we're too concerned about those issues.
Deborah, do you have thoughts on this, kind of picking up on what Tracy is identifying as, perhaps an over-reliance on that argument to justify not releasing data?
Yeah, do you know what was coming to mind as you were talking then, Tracy, was around the need for greater data literacy. So I'm just thinking about people's baseline level of understanding about, what data is, what various aspects mean, how and why we might share it, and to give both the public and organizations and governments the confidence to trust that when we're told that these processes have been undertaken with the data, we've done these rigorous checks, we've anonymized it, we've checked for the risks of re-identification, that they know enough about sort of the data in the digital world to be able to critique what's being said. I'm not saying we just take everything at blind face value, but know enough to critique it, and also trust and recognize when people have gone a reasonable amount. So that opportunity, I think, for education and data literacy is one that that's there for the taking, whether it's we start that early on in our education systems, or whether we bring that in as part of our professional development. I think that's definitely an area where we could all get a bit better.
Thank you. That is very interesting in terms of thinking about that engagement at a very young age, or at least at the beginning of one's career, in terms of the opportunity to become more familiar with both the strengths and the limitations through these data literacy initiatives. And I know, Jean, when you and I had talked prior to today, we were talking about the fact that sometimes protecting the confidentiality of the data while ensuring it's used for public good means that public officials or politicians have to make tough choices, in essence, about who gets access to the data and what the criteria will be for that, so that they might in some instances say, well, we can give access, I'll take for instance, to very seasoned researchers who we know will not risk the confidentiality and the privacy of the data, but that might mean that we exclude others who might not yet have either the data literacy or the sophistication of training to be able to use these data in the appropriate ways. And I'm just wondering, when you're dealing with something like homelessness data or other data that's very sensitive, where the populations themselves may or may not have the skills to use the data effectively, how you deal with this notion of open access versus limiting it to a smaller group, so that research can still be done, but not in a way that undermines the privacy of the data at the end of the day.
Sure. And I think it's more about the approach the researcher's taking than sort of their track record. I mean, obviously, if they've had a data breach before, that's a different issue. Yes. But, in LA, we really believe in the diversity of our data teams. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes young researchers or non-traditional researchers or people coming in from a different perspective may have like the insights we're looking for. So we don't limit it based on sort of like how authoritative the organization or the researcher is, although I'm sure that's probably somewhat helpful, but we're open to new ideas. And I think partly it's understanding sort of all of the data fields that the researcher needs. So we might be able to give them disaggregated data, but de-anonymized data, right? So we might be able to give them the data to the extent that they need to do their research without necessarily identifying each individual person at an individual named level. And we have a program that we started called the Angelino Connect, which gives every person in Los Angeles a unique ID. It's a single sign-on to many city services, but it also then gives us a way of sort of like authoritatively taking names out of the data while still leaving in the essential information. And I think the other thing too is just understanding that, the research that what our end goal is to get better services to individuals and to families and to businesses. And so we're open to different ways of doing that, and still respecting the fact that in serving those people, we want them to feel safe and that they can share information with us, because the last thing we want them is to feel afraid to come forward if they need help with homelessness or domestic violence. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we just want to make sure that people feel that we will treat them safely, including treating their data safely, even if they're not yet data literate, to be aware of how that data could be misused.
Thank you. That's really helpful in terms of clarifications and approach, and again, speaks to just developing that relationship of trust as we move forward. Tracy, we started the conversation with a sense of the vision you had, I think, for, you know, the future of access to data in Canada. These things are often a pendulum that swing back and forth in terms of, you know, more of a focus, say if there have been breaches in some cases on wanting to be more protectionist, and then in other instances recognizing the need to move to a more open flow of data. Where do you see that pendulum in Canada right now? And based on your international experience, where do you think we could be wanting to go in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that that there's a need, and people are wanting to have greater access. And as researchers, I think that lifting some of the red tape to access the data is really important. I know lots of researchers would do more, or would even start accessing data if it was easier to access. So I think the process itself needs to be simplified. And then sometimes we can get access to smaller data sets that don't have all the information in it without having to go to an RDC. But I think trying to provide full data sets in a more secured way, so it doesn't have to be, you know, you download a link or something like that. That's too open, but, you know, being able to provide the data to researchers in their own secured research labs with restrictions and rules on how they can use the data, but also, you know, having the full data sets and not just a simple version of those data sets, I think is really, really important. And I think it's really feasible. And we can do that by maintaining privacy and confidentiality of those who have provided the data to us.
Deborah, from your perspective, where do you see things going in the UK in the next 5 years? You mentioned, you know, the impetus of the UK no longer being part of the EU, and that's no doubt raising a number of important conversations as to how you think about your data domestically, but also internationally. Where are things moving for you in terms of this two ends of the pendulum, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to know, because I think a lot of this stuff is based on politics. However, in that vein, I'm very hopeful that the new expectations on private organisations to meet environmental and social responsibilities is going to up the amount of data that's shared. So there's already demands, and we're starting to see requirements for reporting around environmental impacts to help tackle things like climate change, and also on supply chain management to tackle things like modern slavery. So I'm hoping that those sorts of initiatives and drivers and societal expectations are going to keep driving the push to share a bit more, so that we can get better insights from it and do great things.
And I guess, Jean, you are the politician on the panel. So perhaps from your perspective, I realize that, you know, the federal level and the state level and the municipal level in the States, there may be very different dynamics at play. I don't know whether you see more similarities than differences across the various jurisdictions and levels of government, but where do you think things are going, as generally as you can explain them, or maybe more specifically, at least in the case of Los Angeles, if you feel most comfortable speaking to that?
Sure. Well, I think globally the trends are really interesting. And I just have to give a shout out to Canada and to the UK and to the Open Data Institute, who are early drivers in this whole idea of opening up government data and doing it in standardized ways. And I'm splitting my day today with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network meeting, because what we're seeing is that the ability to decide on standard formats, standard machine readable access to data makes it so much easier to researchers who are looking at maybe sometimes global or regional or comparative issues. And so I think that's really helpful. In the US, there's been a large drive that we led from the federal government that has proliferated to our states and our regions and our cities for chief data officers. So that's somebody who kind of balances the policy role with the technical piece, which is kind of where I grew up on data.gov. And so I think that's really helpful too, because you try to get people who understand the technical issues without trying to make these broad sweeping judgments of either protecting everything or protecting nothing. And so I think that's been helpful. And just the number of collaborative organizations like Open Data Institute and others that are helping cities and governments and organizations too, to share this data, share their data in usable, understandable ways, I think is really helpful, and trustable ways, because that's the other thing I particularly learned in some of my work with the World Bank is just because the government shares data doesn't mean the data is accurate. And so trying to understand, you know, how a government can step up to make that data better.
Well, thank you all. This has been a very thought-provoking discussion, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface of very, very important issues. But for our participants who are gathered here today, I think you've given them much food for thought in terms of being able to follow with interest the developments that are happening in some of our key comparator countries in the UK and the US, as well as benefiting, Tracy, from your perspective as one among our 2,200 researchers who are looking to leverage data for public good. And thank you, Jean, for the shout out to Canada. I know there's been a lot of good work that's been done in terms of open data efforts. So much appreciate hearing that from our international colleagues as well. I had promised I would try and keep us on time, and I believe we're at 2:46. So I think we will probably have Grant jump back in, and we'll let him do so before he takes his hook out. Je voulais tout simplement remercier les participantes ainsi que notre auditoire. Puis je vous souhaite une bonne continuation du Forum des données. Grant, à toi.
Merci, Michelle. Just promoting our next panelists to join us here. Thank you to all of our armchair panelists for an interesting discussion, as Michelle said. A lot of food for thought there. Up next is our